All right. As I stated, I'm Eliza Bowling, the Public Health Advisor for NIHB, and I will be giving our presentation for today. Let me share my screen. Okay. So here's our presentation. Here we go. Disaster declarations. On our agenda today, I'll be going over briefly what is disaster declarations. I'll also have some visual aids and some tips and takeaways for you all to have, just some resources, some video presentations, and as just some documents so everyone can know what they need to declare a declaration, specifically in tribal country, but just in general, this information is good to have. And I hope everyone likes it. First things first, what is a disaster declaration? A disaster declaration usually comes after an extreme weather emergency or a disaster that happens in the local area. It's usually an official proclamation issued by a governmental authority. It can happen at the local, state, or national level, and it's usually in response to a catastrophic event. The declaration is aimed to mobilizing resources, coordinating response efforts, and providing assistance to affected individuals, regions, and other communities. It also triggers the activation of emergency response plans and the deployment of resources to address the immediate needs for those impacted by the disasters. So when we have hurricanes, if we have wildfires, I know we had wildfires this past year and it hit a lot of areas, and you have extreme snowstorms or extreme flooding, generally individuals will reach out to the proper authorities and they will declare the paperwork to the higher ups, usually a presidential nomination or a presidential candidate, will then turn this into a disaster declaration. Some other terms you should know about disaster declaration are state of emergency. This usually, we hear this in terms of extreme cases where something catastrophic has happened and all forces, your National Guard or military forces, are sent to that affected area, and the state is in emergency. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, which is one of the main organizations I will be talking about today, most declarations will be going through them, and they are the ones that will be providing the pathway for the declaration to get from the affected community up to the authorities so that aid can be sent back down to the communities. Emergency management is also one where you'll hear people preparing more in a preventative mindset where they're preparing for emergencies. You don't want an emergency to happen, obviously, but you have to be prepared, and therefore you have to have management over these emergencies. There are different declaration types as well. There's major disasters, local disasters, public assistance, individual assistance, and the mitigation measures. The process for a tribal declaration, federally recognized tribal governments have the option to request a presidential emergency or a major disaster declaration, independent of a state. These tribal governments may still choose to seek assistance as they have historically under a state declaration request. There's also the presidential emergency. Through that process is implemented in 3 phases. As of January 2013, 2017, they can use the SRIA immediately following its enactment. FEMA will begin processing the tribal declaration requests using the state declaration regulations. There was also a pilot period where the release of the declaration's pilot guidance marked the official beginning of the pilot period for tribal declarations. And then also following the pilot period, FEMA implemented the authority through notice and rulemaking. I'm going to show you guys a brief document here real quick. So this document FEMA has put together is basically just a brief 2-pager that talks about incidents that have affected certain tribal areas, and how that process is supposed to work. So tribal government activates its emergency plan, and then it starts to dedicate its own resources to response activities, and then requests mutual aid from partners, volunteers, and other government organizations. And the tribal governments would collect initial damage estimates. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Initial damage estimates to identify what needs, so how much water is needed, how much buildings are damaged, what materials are needed to, in terms of first aid, how many people have been injured, how many people are safe. Then the tribal government will determine what needs after they've used their resources and supported their communities with what they have. They go through and make sure to see what other resources they need, and then they request that information. They then would send through the FEMA the preliminary damage assessment, and with this damage assessment, FEMA and other regional administrators are able to determine how much support is needed immediately, if it's a major scale emergency or if it's more of a local minor, not minor, but local emergency where they don't need the National Guard necessarily, but they could use local fire stations or anything that's nearby. FEMA then reviews these requests and sends a recommendation to the president and his staff, and then the president then makes a determination, which then FEMA will send back that notification along with the aid to the individuals. In response to immediate damages to infrastructure, they take steps to mitigate impacts. They implement the current or already in place tribal response plans. If there aren't any tribal response plans in action, they will work to make sure that there is one, and that will go through as part of the process while they're submitting that information to the president and his staff. If they have a response plan, if a response plan is not in place, they will help them put one together, and then they will submit that information over. This document is a more of a draft, but is based off the official request for presidential declaration of disasters for a major disaster emergency. As you see, it's 4 pages long, and you fill out all this information, the date and all these documents. So once you have this filled out along with your plan, you will submit it to, you reach out to your FEMA authority agent, and they would take this documentation along with a few other things and just figure out what level of care or what level of information and what level of support is needed on the back end. I've provided a few visual aids for us to look through as well, which goes more into depth about the declaration process. We'll go here first.
In this video, we'll provide you with a broad overview of the federal disaster process to help you determine key decision points. This video informs tribal elected officials on how to be prepared to make decisions in a disaster to serve and protect your people, communities, land, and economies. I'm here with Rochelle, who will help provide context to our processes. Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, Sammy. Thanks for having me.
So, Rochelle, why is it valuable for tribal leaders to know about the federal disaster process?
It is important for tribal leaders and elected officials to know about the disaster process because if they're trained in advance, it supports the emergency manager when you're already in crisis. It gives them ability to make those key decisions that need to be made in a timely manner.
And how does the disaster declaration process work with your tribe's sovereignty?
Trust responsibility with the federal government and FEMA being the face of that during disaster has to do with giving the tribes an option of how they want to address the disaster and the declaration. Do we want to do it at the closest local level? Do we want to work with the state or with our federal partners? And each community should have that ability to make that choice. And they do through the processes that have come through with the federal government. The disaster declaration process is set up to be able to support the tribe during a disaster by having direct service with the tribe and honoring their sovereignty as a nation. However, it also supports the ability to work with the county, the state, and with FEMA in a way that suits our community best. And that is important because we have a really good relationship with our county, the state, and FEMA. And depending on the disaster, we may want to choose.
So what are some of the disasters your tribe has experienced? What happened and how did your tribe respond?
On an annual basis, the Tulalip tribes has really bad winter storms where we are often without power for several days. This is a threat to our community because we have elders who have critical needs and all of our families. So we respond to this by making sure we have a coordinated effort and we practice prior to the season to make sure that not only our departments can respond appropriately, but our communities prepare themselves.
And why do tribes care about emergency management?
We care about emergency management because it's really about the people. Tribes are there to take care of their people, and that's what emergency management does. We also are really invested in protecting our land and our culture, and all of this is really the basis of what emergency management is to us still currently.
Well, an element of trust responsibility is the federal government's role to support tribes when a disaster is beyond their capability to respond to and or recover from. A tribal chief executive can request two types of declarations through the appropriate FEMA regional administrator: an emergency declaration and a major disaster declaration. Emergency declarations: the president can declare an emergency for any occasion or instance when a president determines federal assistance is needed to support tribal efforts and capabilities to save lives, protect property, public health, and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe in any part of the United States. Emergency declarations provide immediate short-term assistance. Major disaster declarations: the president can declare a major disaster for any natural catastrophe or any fire, flood, or explosion, regardless of the cause, that the president has determined that has caused damage of such severity that is beyond the combined capabilities of tribal governments to respond to and recover from. A major disaster declaration may provide a wide range of federal assistance programs for individuals and public infrastructure, including funds for emergency work, permanent work, and mitigation. Federal disaster assistance process begins locally. And first, let's see how an incident affects the tribe. Tribal government activates their emergency plan and dedicates resources to respond. The tribe collects initial damage estimates to identify needs. Tribal governments determine that the needs remain after all of the resources, such as assistance from other federal agencies, volunteer agencies, and mutual aid partners, are exhausted. The chief executive requests joint preliminary damage assessments or PDAs from FEMA or decides to participate in joint FEMA state preliminary damage assessments. Tribal governments review results of the joint damage assessments and determine whether Stafford Act assistance should be requested. If requesting Stafford Act assistance independently of the state, the chief executive submits a request to the president through the FEMA regional administrator within 30 days of the end of the incident. FEMA reviews the request and sends a recommendation to the president. The president then makes a determination and FEMA notifies the chief executive.
We have always taken care of our people, land, resources, and surrounding communities. Understanding the federal disaster process will help us to continue to get the right support and resources we need to respond and recover from future disasters.
That's always been true for tribes, Rochelle. Continue watching the Tribal Recovery video series that outline key steps and decision points in the disaster process. For more information on the disaster declaration process, check out the FEMA Tribal Declarations Pilot Guidance on FEMA.gov. If you have questions, you can always reach out to your regional FEMA tribal liaison.
All right. So that was basically the overview of the process. I do have steps 1 through 5 on the rest of the process here, which I'll come back to towards the end once we get through all of them. Apologies, technical difficulties. A few tips here before we go back to the videos here are the documents for, as I showed you earlier, was the presidential declaration. And these slides will be available to you all. We'll send them out through emails if anyone wants them, and they'll also be on the recording for the website as well. There's also this cover letter template, which is what you would include in addition to the presidential declaration. And then also the paper process, how to request a declaration, which is here. And this basically shows who by tribe has already done a federal disaster declaration and who experienced it and how they went through the FEMA process. It doesn't include all of the federally recognized tribes that went through this process, but it includes quite a few of them. So maybe if you have time, we can go through and see all the different tribes that have gone through and see their process and see what is needed for and how basically to go through their process and what they needed and what information was done and how it looks. Also on this side, I have links to the guide of what happens once you have requested a disaster declaration, and you've done the process, and then you are in the back end where you're starting to receive aid, and what you should do from that point on as well. And there are just a few other resources for you as well as a link to the direct YouTube page that has all the information. I will briefly go back to the other videos really quickly now that I've gone through all the resources for you all so that you guys can finish watching these. 1 second, please.
Welcome to FEMA's Tribal Recovery video series. In this video, we will cover step 1, outline initial response and some best practices for assessing damage. Tribal elected officials understand initial response to an incident and the need to assess damage to public infrastructure in the community. And I'm here with Sabrina. Welcome, Sabrina.
Hi, Zuni. Thanks for having me today.
So, Sabrina, why do tribes care about assessing damage properly?
Tribal governments respond to emergencies and disasters routinely. Activating the emergency plan and tracking and assessment of damages is essential in determining the need to request for federal assistance.
Well, describe the immediate priorities when responding to an incident.
When responding to an incident, it's initially important to understand what you're dealing with. So your initial assessment, seeing what types of resources are going to be required to deal with it, and then setting up your documentation trail is very important.
In the event of a disaster, the tribe's immediate priority is the safety of people, community, land, and resources. Those initial response activities can include performing life-saving and life-sustaining activities such as sheltering, feeding and evacuee support, engaging the tribal first responder capabilities, activating the tribal emergency operations plan, declaring a state of emergency within the tribe, using existing mutual aid agreements, checking safety of public infrastructure, documenting the work, begin saving documentation associated with any costs incurred to implement your emergency operations plan. The disaster declaration process starts at the local level, where damage information is initially collected with tribal authorities. FEMA can provide you with an initial damage assessment checklist to support the collection and assessment of damage. The tribe collects initial damage estimates to identify unmet needs, damage such as threats to life, health, and public safety, and the emergency actions taken to protect against them. The number of people who have been displaced, how many primary homes are damaged or destroyed, the extent of insurance coverage, both private and tribal, the extent of business losses, and damage that prevent homes from being safely habitable, damage to infrastructure.
It's important to have and activate the tribal emergency plan and to accurately assess and track damage. Both of these will be required if the tribe decides to request federal assistance.
At any point in responding to an event, the tribe may reach out to surrounding jurisdictions, the state or FEMA, for additional response or coordination resources and our initial support for initial damage assessments. Be sure to watch the next video to see step 2, requesting preliminary damage assessments, validating damage, and determining if additional assistance is needed. For more information,
Step 2.
welcome to FEMA's Tribal Recovery Video Series. Step 2, requesting preliminary damage assessments. After conducting internal initial damage assessments, the tribe needs to determine if this exceeds the tribe's capabilities to respond and recover from. The tribe may request a joint PDA in which tribal officials articulate the unmet needs of their communities. I'm here with Sherry to discuss this. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, Zuni. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So, Sherry, why do tribes care about the PDA process?
A key part of the disaster request process is joint assessment and validation of damages by tribal governments to determine who is eligible for potential grant funding.
So can you speak on why tribal leaders need to make the best decision for the tribe based on initial damage assessments?
Tribe's internal review and decision process includes discussing the benefits and challenges of working directly with FEMA or the state or the surrounding counties. Tribal executives need to know enough information to make decisions that will lead to the best recovery outcomes. These are important discussions to understand how and what level of assistance the tribe could be eligible for, as well as what are the costs financially to the tribe and the staffing resources potentially needed.
So Sherry, who decides to request the preliminary damage assessment from FEMA?
That would be the chief executive makes that joint PDA request to FEMA or decides to participate in joint FEMA state PDAs.
And what option does the tribe have based on the results of the PDA?
Based on the results of the PDA, the tribe may submit a declaration request to the president through the FEMA regional administrator. Participate in the state request for presidential declaration as a sub-applicant or direct recipient. Determine not to seek federal assistance.
And what are the factors to consider when determining which option to take?
To determine which option to take, the tribal leaders and emergency manager need to consider the benefits and challenges working directly with FEMA or the state or the surrounding counties. These are important discussions to understand how and what level of assistance the tribe could be eligible for, as well as what are the costs financially to the tribe and the staffing resources potentially needed. The state may provide staffing resources to administer disaster programs or take on the administrative paperwork. Some states will fund a portion of the 25% cost share to reduce the cost of burden.
After conducting internal initial damage assessments, tribal leaders review these assessments to determine if the damage exceeds their capability to respond and recover. The tribe reviews damage and the chief executive determines if they want to request preliminary damage assessments from FEMA or decides to participate in joint FEMA state preliminary damage assessments. The preliminary damage assessment team will jointly survey damage. These joint team assessments may last anywhere from a few days to over a week. Then the preliminary damage assessment team will compile reports which will be used by tribal leaders to determine whether to request a presidential major disaster or emergency declaration. The tribe will have to demonstrate a certain level of Stafford Act damage, including damage to tribal-owned infrastructure, impacts to people, and affected homes, to be eligible for FEMA assistance. There are key deadlines throughout the process. A crucial one is that the tribe generally has 30 days from the end of the incident to determine whether or not federal assistance is necessary. Extensions are an option. Request support in making sure that you understand the deadlines to make decisions or request additional support from FEMA or state partners.
The main goal of the disaster declaration request is articulating the unmet needs of your communities and to potentially access federal funding.
That's it on step 2. The next video takes us to step 3, where we explain the assistance programs you can request. For more information on the disaster declaration process,
Apologies all. This is about to be step 3 for all your viewing.
welcome to FEMA's Tribal Recovery Video Series, Step 3, FEMA Disaster Assistance Primary Programs. We will discuss the administrative requirements for public assistance, individual assistance, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. I'm here with Brandy. Hiya, Brandy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Brandy, why do tribes care about these types of programs?
Tribal leaderships need to understand how these programs can support the recovery from an event. The damage assessments gives the tribal leadership a better idea of what the program they may be eligible for and what to request in a disaster declaration.
Can you provide an example of how your tribe has experienced implementing one of these programs?
Our tribes have worked with the state and counties in the beds with flooding, wildfire, and our COVID-19 pandemic. We have been reimbursed for eligible costs through the pandemic, vaccines, clinics, staffing, resources to backfill. We've also supported our surrounding counties in implementing shelter operations. We've helped with sandbagging during flooding and many more. We train on these programs so that we are informed to make the right decisions for our tribe.
So, Brandy, can you describe the 3 primary programs for FEMA disaster assistance?
The 3 programs for FEMA disaster assistance are the public assistance, individual assistance, and then the hazard mitigation program. There are many other assistance programs too that we work through with the counties. We've got MOUs through Red Cross and some other non-governmental communities as well.
Keep in mind that this assistance is for addressing 2 types of declarations: emergency declarations and major disaster declarations. If you recall from video 1, disaster overview, emergency declarations may supplement tribal government efforts in providing emergency services, such as protection of lives, property, public health, and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of catastrophe in any part of the United States. And a major disaster declaration may provide a wide range of federal assistance programs for individuals and public infrastructure, including funds for both emergency and permanent work. Federal assistance may be available for uninsured or underinsured needs, or when insurance benefits are significantly delayed. When tribal leadership makes the decision to work directly with FEMA to administer FEMA programs, it's imperative that you have functions and staff in place to administer these programs. Staff to support a disaster can include an emergency manager, financial staff, public works, tribal historic preservation officer, and others. Disaster declarations can fund permanent repairs to damaged infrastructure, provide low-interest loans and grants to people, and offset future damage through mitigation. There are 3 FEMA assistance programs available to request. The first is individual assistance. FEMA provides assistance directly to individuals. It's designed to provide basic support and a safe, secure, and habitable place to live while tribal members chart their recovery. Individual assistance may also include crisis counseling, disaster case management, disaster unemployment assistance, and disaster legal services. The sequence of delivery. Disaster relief agencies and organizations provide assistance to survivors in a specific order called the sequence of delivery. This is intended to prevent the duplication of benefits, maximize available resources, and coordinate the efforts to help survivors navigate the recovery process. FEMA is only one piece of the disaster recovery puzzle. The first rule of emergency management is that all disasters are inherently local, and as such, local governments and voluntary organizations are the first responders and care providers after disasters. Voluntary agencies provide immediate assistance, usually frequently faith-based, and vary by local affiliation. Mass care, such as sheltering, distribution of supplies, donations management, feeding, support to pets, is typically provided by the government, voluntary and private sector organizations. FEMA's role is to support the coordination and provision of these services as requested by the tribe or state. Insurance. Personal insurance must be exhausted before a survivor can be considered for FEMA assistance. However, assistance may be available for uninsured or underinsured needs, or when insurance benefits are significantly delayed. For more information, visit FEMA.gov and search individual assistance. The second program is public assistance. This program provides reimbursement funding for eligible emergency protective measures and repair of tribal-owned facilities damaged in disasters. Typical projects include debris removal, emergency protective measures, damaged roads, bridges, public buildings, utilities, parks. For more information, visit FEMA.gov and search public assistance. The third program is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is mitigation funding to reduce the damage to life and property. To be eligible, you need to have an approved mitigation plan. FEMA may provide funding to write and update your plan. It's important to note that an approved mitigation plan is also required for public assistance permanent. For more information, visit FEMA.gov and search hazard mitigation. Brandy, how does FEMA implement these types of programs for tribes?
FEMA only fills in the gaps. So FEMA implements programs designed to ensure that individuals and communities maximize the assistance from the federal government without duplication.
What does the duplication of benefits help resolve?
It's to maximize the available resources and coordinate efforts to help disaster survivors navigate the recovery process. FEMA and the tribal government will work together to ensure there is no duplication of benefits. FEMA cannot provide financial assistance when any other source, such as insurance, has provided assistance for the same disaster.
For more information, visit FEMA.gov and search duplication of benefits. Understanding the individual assistance, public assistance, and hazard mitigation grant program is essential to determine which programs may support a tribe's recovery. Tribal leadership determines which programs to request assistance from. If a tribe is requesting assistance independently of the state, the chief executive submits a request to the president through a FEMA regional administrator within 30 days of the end of the incident. That's it on step 3. The next video takes us to step 4, where we review disaster declarations and the first 30 days. Welcome to FEMA's Tribal Recovery Video Series, Step 4, Disaster Declarations and the First 30 Days. Tribal officials understand what happens after the president makes a determination on the disaster assistance request. There are many players that can be brought in to support their people and communities' recovery from a disaster. And I'm here with Angel to discuss why tribes need to provide staff to support disaster recovery program implementation. Hi, Angel.
Hi, Zuni. Thanks for having me.
So, Angel, why are the first 30 days so important after a disaster declaration?
Tribal executives need to understand the resources required to directly administer FEMA's assistance in order to make the best decision about whether to request a declaration directly. There are deadlines involved for requests. This is why the first 30 days is critical to communicate the tribe's needs after a disaster has occurred, so that you can get the help you need as soon as possible.
Thanks. It's important to understand the process to secure funding and resources. Based on the data from the preliminary damage assessments, a tribal government can decide to make a disaster declaration request, be a direct recipient pursuant to a state declaration, or be a subrecipient of the state. If the tribe requests directly, FEMA notifies the chief executive of the president's decision. If a direct declaration is approved, initial steps include appointing a federal coordinating officer, a tribal coordinating officer, and entering into a FEMA tribe agreement outlining commitments and conditions under which FEMA's disaster assistance will be provided. No disaster funding or direct federal assistance will be authorized until the FEMA tribe agreement has been signed. FEMA personnel may deploy to the impacted areas to support tribal staff in response and recovery activities.
Here are some thoughts on staffing. Tribal leadership must support disaster recovery with appropriate resources, such as tribal coordinating and programmatic support, depending on the scope of the operation. It can require fairly extensive involvement. For example, staff need to support a disaster recovery could include emergency manager, financial staff, public works, tribal historical preservation officer, natural resources, fire, police, and others. FEMA provides some funding to reimburse costs directly related to administering the public assistance and hazard mitigation grant program.
FEMA will assist recipients in fulfilling post-declaration requirements, including the following: signing the FEMA tribe agreement and submitting the application for federal assistance, as well as several administrative plans required to access funding. FEMA staff can provide technical assistance in developing administrative plans. The tribal chief executive can request a designation of additional programs within 30 days of the declaration or at the end of the incident period, whichever is later. The tribal chief executive may submit an extension request within the 30-day period, providing a valid reason for supporting an extension.
To successfully administer FEMA programs, we need to dedicate staff and resources to help us recover from a disaster.
Check out the next video on step 5. What comes next? Road to recovery. Welcome to FEMA's Tribal Recovery video series, Step 5, the Road to Recovery. I'm here with Rochelle to discuss what to expect throughout the disaster recovery. Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, Zuni.
FEMA personnel will be working side by side with tribal government employees to administer the public assistance and hazard mitigation grant programs. FEMA will lead the individual assistance program. The tribe can expect a significant amount of work in developing specific administrative plans, completing emergency and permanent work, and tracking projects, including dispersing disaster funds, robust reporting, and documentation. It will help tribes to know how long they can expect FEMA's programs to take. Individual assistance is typically finished within 1 year. Public assistance can take 4 or more years. The hazard mitigation grant program typically takes about 6 years. The effectiveness of these programs is directly dependent on the level of staffing and support the tribal government provides. FEMA programs are a partnership from beginning to end. FEMA must provide good partnership, and the tribe's needs to reciprocate the relationship. Without continued long-term support from the tribal government, delivery of FEMA programs and reimbursement of eligible funding can be delayed.
As tribes, we are sovereign and need to work towards being sovereign. The federal, state, county, they are all partners to support our disaster preparedness and recovery. In supporting disaster preparedness, recovery, and mitigation, we get the help we need in building capabilities to protect our communities. There are steps you can take now. Reach out and see what support your emergency manager needs. Connect with FEMA tribal liaisons, meet your FEMA regional administrator, and take FEMA training.
Don't wait until you have a disaster to reach out. Start talking to FEMA now. Build that relationship with us and your emergency manager. For more information on the disaster declaration process, check out the FEMA Tribal Declarations Pilot Guidance on FEMA.gov.
Right. I know that was a lot of information at one time, but does anyone have any questions? Again, these slides will be will be shared through emails if people request it. They're also recording will be placed on our NIHB's website for future viewing, as well as being able to look and see where the hyperlinks are on the YouTube page will be linked underneath. No questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining this webinar. I'm glad to have been able to share this information with you. I hope at the very least it was some information that could be shared with your tribes or with your cohorts or with your organizations, or just information to have just in general. I have in the chat placed the evaluation link just to know what could be done better, what should be done better, what topics we would like to talk about in future webinars. It should be in the chat. I will share it again as well. Be sure to fill that out. I hope everyone has an excellent day, and thank you for joining. You all are free to go if you wish.